faster.
You know,
Let's talk about.
overseas, a lot of people call this the Newland administration, not the Biden administration, because Newland has been there. She was Cheney's advisor. She was the Bush ambassador to NATO when the NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia was put, this disastrous idea that got us into this was put into the NATO agenda, by the way, over the huge objections of the Europeans at the time. She was the ambassador to NATO under the Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war did start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Newland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Newland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine.
Nothing is fine. I want to ask you back at the debt, on the topic of the debt. There are those, Jeffrey Sachs, who say, you know what, we don't have to worry about the debt, so-called debt crisis, because our dollar is not backed by gold. We can just keep printing dollars. This is, I think, modern monetary theory. We can afford whatever we want. What would you say to them?
Well, it's technically right. What you do, technically, the Treasury borrows from the open market, and then the Federal Reserve buys that debt from the bondholder, puts money into the economy, and takes the debt back onto the books of the Fed. So it's no longer owed to the public. The debt is now owed to another unit of the government. But what happens is the money supply has gone up. So it is printing money to finance the war. The problem with that is that, again, you can do it to an extent, but if you do it too much, you get inflation. And in 2021 and 2022, we had a blowout of the money supply. I've been a monetary economist for 43 years. I mentioned international. I never saw it. In fact, it never happened before, such a large increase of the money supply. And then you start having inflation. The first inflation was that every crazy cryptocurrency soared in value, and then the stock market soared in value, and asset prices soared in value, and non-fungible tokens soared in value. But then it got into the commodities markets. Now it's getting into the real, you go to the grocery store, it's into the real economy. And so that's what happens when you print trillions of dollars, which is what we did in 2021, 2022. So you can do it. It's just that you have consequences when you do it. Don't do it and think you're going to get away with it just completely printing money. Lots of governments have tried that for actually a couple millennia. It's called debasing the currency. And you can do it for a little while, but after a while, you better pay your bills. That's the basic point.
Thank you. For those of you who just tuned in, I'm Marcy Winograd for Code Pink Radio. I am with the distinguished Jeffrey Sachs, economist, public policy analyst, who's been doing this for decades, talking about this debt crisis of anywhere from $24 trillion to $31 trillion, and the betrayal of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who promised that he would not deliver a blank check for military spending. And yet, all talk of cutting the military budget has suddenly evaporated during this period in which he is negotiating with President Biden and demanding cuts in Social Security and Medicare, food stamps, and so forth. Jeffrey Sachs.
I wish we heard Biden saying, well, at least we'll cut the military budget. I'm not hearing that either. Neither of them.
No. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's say you're in the White House. You're in the Oval Office. You have
hard
the
to
pen.
believe.
I'm going to put you there right now. And you're meeting maybe with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, and you say, look, this is out of control. This debt we have. We need to cut the military budget, slash it. What are you going to cut in that budget?
First thing I'm going to say, God, we thought we were going to bluff Putin and so forth, and just NATO enlargement was going to go on, and he called the bluff, and now we're in this ridiculous, horrible, tragic, destructive, expensive war. We're going to tell him, okay, no NATO enlargement, you go home. In other words, we're going to negotiate the end of this, which started with these provocations of overthrowing a neutral government and overthrowing the sanity of not moving NATO right up to a nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Russia and all that. So I would stop the war through negotiation. That would be the first thing. We'd save a lot of money. Second, I would say, look, we just had the accounting by SIPRI, which is the Stockholm Institute that keeps track of who spends what on the military. The United States is spending more than the next 10 countries combined. And I'm talking about China among those countries. We're spending 3 times China's military spending. We're spending more than the next 10 countries combined. Let's get this under control. Then I would point out that we have 800 military bases abroad. China, 1 or 2, depending on how you count, maybe a small one in Djibouti, maybe 1 or 2 others. We have 800. Okay, we don't need 800 for our security. It's not adding to our security, it's adding to our debt enormously. So let's get this under control. Let's take out an Excel spreadsheet also and do this right. Real numbers, not gimmicks. Let's see what we need to do in taxes, because God, there's so many loopholes here that it's unbelievable. But at the same time, let's stop waste on the, not just waste, tragic spending on the military industrial complex, because that is where we have wasted so much of our money.
Yes, and when we create, I don't like that word, it has a positive connotation, but when we produce, or the military contractors who are really making a killing off of killing, when they produce new weapon systems, these systems emit tremendous greenhouse gases. So there is that connection, and too often we see environmentalists and peace activists operating in silos. And at Code Pink, we have a War is Not Green campaign because we think it's essential that we integrate these campaigns, because the military is a driver of the climate crisis. The Pentagon is the single largest global institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, consumer of oil and fossil fuels, and too much of that is under the radar. So let's talk about it. Now, let's also talk about what we're doing at Code Pink.
Great.
This week and next week. We have grassroots activists on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, Medea Benjamin, Olivia DiNucci, who many people met when she disrupted. Well, she's disrupted a few times those powers that be that insist on all of this never-ending spending for the military, including Joe Biden. So anyway, they're going to be on Capitol Hill with others, visiting key lawmakers' offices and saying, look, this is our petition. Code Pink is a partner in the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which represents over 100 organizations. We have a petition calling on Biden, Putin, and Zelensky to support a ceasefire and peace negotiations now. And I thank you, Jeffrey Sachs, because you are one of the prominent signers of that petition, along with others such as Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Dr. Cornel West, Ann Wright, Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, even Roger Waters, the co-founder of Pink Floyd, has signed that, as well as Dennis Kucinich, one of my heroes, who was in Congress for many years and a great peace champion. So we are taking this ceasefire petition not only to offices on Capitol Hill, but also fanning out across the country to deliver it to congressional offices, along with a full-page ad that ran in the New York Times last week. Thank you very much, Eisenhower Media Network. And this ad said, let the United States be a force for peace in the world instead of, well, I'm adding this now, instead of a force for war and destruction. There are those, however, Jeffrey Sachs, you know, there are those who disagree with this call for a ceasefire. They think it's controversial. They say, no, we cannot have a ceasefire because then Russia, Putin would end up with this annexed territory in the Donbass and in Crimea. Whether that was an annexation or reunification is certainly up for debate. What would you say to them?
I think it's really important to get to negotiations and to understand the roots of this war. This war came because we kept pushing NATO. And at the end of 2021, Putin put on the table, actually, you want to avoid war, here is a draft Russia-US security treaty. And it had several points, the most important of which is stop the NATO expansion. And you know what the White House said? No way we're going to talk to Russia about NATO expansion. That's our business. It has nothing to do with Russia. Of course it has to do with Russia. We're about to put NATO right up against the Russian border. And so this was calamitously misguided foreign policy in the United States. And it's not just me saying it. The leading American diplomats have been saying this for decades now. Don't do this. George Kennan, William Burns, who's our CIA director right now, warned about this in 2008. And William Perry, who was our Clinton's Secretary of Defense, nearly resigned over Clinton deciding to enlarge NATO because Perry was saying, we're going to start another Cold War with Russia. So it's possible to negotiate. But it's actually been, strangely enough, the United States that has absolutely rejected diplomacy. Americans probably couldn't believe that, but it's actually true. And it's at least two recent occasions. One is at the end of 2021, when Putin was putting a diplomatic initiative on the table. And we said, no, we're not going to talk about it. NATO enlargements, none of your business. That's what we told the Russians. And then at the start of the invasion, just a couple weeks after the invasion, Zelensky said, all right, okay, we could think about neutrality. We should negotiate. Now, I know what happened there because I've spoken to people that were deeply involved in this. Right at the beginning, the Ukrainians said, we could really we don't have to be in NATO. We could have guarantees from other ways. And the Russians said, okay, let's talk. And the Turkish diplomats said, we'll mediate. And so real mediation started. And actually, the former prime minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, got into the act as an informal mediator. Towards the end of March 2022, they actually were working on the draft agreement to end the war. I'm talking about more than a year ago. And the United States said no. The United States said no diplomacy. Nobody questioned that in the mainstream media here, because when's the last time you read in the New York Times a real understanding of this war. It doesn't exist in the New York Times. They just want, I think it was a joke on the New York Times, actually. They got some, somebody from the CIA or someplace or the White House told them it was some people in a yacht. It was 6 people in a boat. That story lasted about 24 hours. I mean, it didn't even last 2 minutes in my view. I thought it was hilarious, not substantive. But the New York Times ran it with a straight face, but they wouldn't run Seymour Hersh's account and then discuss it. So they're not even covering the news and much less challenging a critical thought. And
I would
that's
agree.
Pretty serious.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and their coverage of what's happening in Ukraine have really assigned themselves to irrelevancy because they are Pentagon PR flacks who just repeat talking points. And there's no serious investigation into any aspect of this war. And that's why, at Code Pink, we support alternative, non-corporate journalism. Please tell others. Code Pink Radio will tell you the truth. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's talk about China a little bit further. Yeah. China has come out with the 12-point peace proposal, which Biden immediately dismissed as, what did he say? He said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe 1 or 2 overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900-kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand the what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008. By God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Newland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I
Okay?
think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, you know, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, you know, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way,
biggest
if I may just,
proliferator of nuclear
if I may
weapons.
just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back, and now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, yeah, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it. Stop. Don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this: NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in
But-
2019,
but just to
Ukraine
say-
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon-
Jeffrey Sachs,
Yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that BlackRock, representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. This is the first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the U.S. is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you. I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the US grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting, because there is no military path to victory, because Russia can escalate, and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review. The Biden administration says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first, or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
And again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step. It's time for the Nuland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity.
Deep, real, intensifying, and at an urgent stage. We're already in the acute phase of human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which claims many millions of lives per year. We're already in the acute phase of human-induced climate change, destruction of biodiversity, massive pollution, which we hear wisdom someplace. Thank you. These all require public goods of a new kind at a global, regional, biome, ecosystem scale. And of course, we're grappling with creating that, and we're not succeeding now 51 years after the first conference on environment and economy in Stockholm. We have rapid demographic change, not all bad. The world population is going to stabilize and start to decline in the 21st century. That's a good thing. We're completing the demographic transition, an aging economy, an urban world economy, a significant rise of Africa's share in the world economy to perhaps 1/4 or even 1/3 of the world population by later in this century. And we now, as I'm emphasizing, have public goods at regional, by that I mean transnational, and global scale to an extent that is unprecedented. And that requires a different kind of governance. So we have outgrown the nation state. We need political subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the concept that we don't have competing polities at different levels. We have a kind of concentric circle of politics where global problems get solved globally, regional problems get addressed regionally, national problems get addressed nationally, local problems get addressed locally, with the basic dictum, go as local as possible, consistent with the problem. And I think that this is the right idea about public goods. U.S. hegemony is a chimera, very dangerous right now because everybody knows it except the United States. And so the U.S. is actually provoking a lot of war and tension and conflict right now as it struggles to come to grips with its limited power. And fourth, we're going to need an ethical basis for the global and regional public goods, because all of economic life depends on an ethical formation, shared precepts, implicit or explicit, and this now has to happen at a global level, and I'll give a few thoughts to that very quickly. I wrote a bit about this in a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, and my main theme was that to understand global scale change, we need to understand the interplay of physical geography, technological change, and institutional change. And all three are paramount in our own age. And of course, as a materialist as I am, I believe that human history has essentially been paced by technological breakthroughs and essentially in energy, food, transport, and data. Data defined broadly to include computation, transmission, storage of information. And the major eras of human change are eras of breakthrough. Fire was the first era that enabled us to have larger brains, so the encephalization came with the harnessing of fire, the harnessing of agriculture, the domestication of the horse, the discovery of how to mobilize wind and water power already 2.5 to 3 millennia ago. Of course, the breakthrough with fossil fuel, with the steam engine in the 18th century, with the electric dynamo in the 19th century, nuclear age, and so forth. So all of this is to say we are very much paced by large technological changes. The dominant technological changes of our day came out of the wonderful imagination of Alan Turing and John von Neumann and the architects of the digital world with the transistors and integrated circuits, and this is a deep transformation that is propelling us today. So in good classical Enlightenment form, I approach this as a stadial theory of change, meaning you make stages. I designate 7 stages. I won't go through them in this brief period, but each is paced by major technological change, which gives rise to political change. It creates city-states, or nations, or empires, or transoceanic empires. And we are in another phase of fundamental political change. So just a word about the geography of long-term development. An unbelievable amount of economic development takes place between these narrow latitudes because they are favored with the lucky fortune of a band of east-west geography of temperate and semi-arid zone steppelands and temperate agriculture, which encompassed typically 70 or 80% of the world population and almost all of the technological changes in history, and the major empires line up incredibly along this line throughout history. So in most of human history, Asia was, from as far back as we know it, the most populated part of the world, 65 to 70% of world population. China and India have been giants in population for 2 millennia at least. And for most of that time, per capita income didn't vary so much as we know, and I'm using Angus Madison's famous estimates here, it meant that the shares of output more or less tracked the shares of population, with the modest variation for different periods, like the Song Dynasty being a particularly prosperous period in China, for example. But aside from the ups and downs, Asia was the center of gravity of the world system. Then, of course, this began to change very gradually after the beginning of the 16th century, in the so-called Age of Discovery or Age of Conquest, and it really took off after the end of the 18th century because of the steam engine, fundamentally, the era of industrialization. And since that came to England first, England used that to conquer much of the world. Just to say, as everybody knows, it is the great accident of history that Europe became the first to industrialize and to conquer Asia, because it was absolutely far more likely, I'd say something like 10 to 1 in favor of China in the 15th century, that it would go the other way. China was very close to discovering the sea routes to Europe and even possibly to the Americas across the northern Pacific. But in 1434, the single worst economic policy mistake in human history was made when the mandarins at the Ming court scrapped the Chinese fleet and just ended what was the mega age of discovery and oceanic transport of the giant fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Absolutely no deep reason for it. It was a catastrophic mistake. The next time the sea routes were opened between Europe and Asia was Europeans going to conquer Asia, not Asians going to explore and trade with Europe. So Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And my favorite lines from The Wealth of Nations, which is a remarkably wonderful and humane book, as well as a brilliant treatise. But my favorite part is this. Adam Smith says, "The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope," that's 1498 and 1492, "are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind." Big statement. Not bad. Connecting the whole world by these two oceanic voyages. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, "Hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements, which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it." So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. the steam engine a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire, but it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine, and there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet. But this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths again using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track. Nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation, and so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because. But we love you, and we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO, and the Iraq War was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally Assad with the CIA regime change operation. And oh yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border, and not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the US conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the US government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then, it started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the US poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing, because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story since 2014. And really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the US pushed
the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the US government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliances? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying. And yeah, NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia, and the rest of Ukraine. And, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic
Yep.
Sea as well.
Yep. You
They've
got
cut
it.
them off from the Baltic Sea
They got
with Finland.
these are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah.
It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, and they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me, but the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Been already, but full membership is something else. Could you just summarize your proposals?
So my basic idea is we don't need more process. We don't need more 10 years of negotiation. We don't need another Oslo process. There's no way to say more about this issue than has been said for the last 50 years. We have to understand that the two parties cannot solve this by themselves. Each one is locked into its own extremism, and there's zero trust between the two sides, to say the least. So in this case, we have an international community that is essentially united on this with one crucial footnote, which is the United States has blocked this approach for decades, even though it is, quote, in favor of this approach. Even Biden said a couple of weeks ago, we support the two-state solution. But the United States political system has given essentially a blank check to Israel for decades so that it murmurs support for the two-state solution, but it does not enforce it. American politicians have long believed for decades that support for Israel is vital for their political health because they have believed that that's where the big campaign contributions come from. That's in line with the military-industrial complex system, which is politically quite powerful. And they believe that's where public opinion is. But in the U.S., public opinion has turned against Israel because the American people do not want to be complicit in this massacre, and they are not supportive of the so-called Greater Israel, which means Israel dominance over Palestine. They are supportive of two states. Every opinion survey for decades has demonstrated this. That's true of American Jews, by the way, not just of the American public generally. We're not so far from that because the Security Council is basically 13 to 1 to 1. That is 13 countries support what I'm saying. One opposes it, the United States, and one always goes along with the U.S. That's the UK. Shame on them. First of all, they should grow up. Second, they should recognize they're no longer a world empire. And third, they should take some responsibility for the mess that they left. So, but aside from that, that's a footnote as far as I'm concerned. The real story here is the U.S. And I'm trying to say to U.S. public officials, look, you're completely alone supporting something you don't even support. So you have to do something more creative. Now, unfortunately, President Biden's not creative. He lacks the energy and insight. His foreign policy team is extremely weak. So I don't know whether we'll get there or not, but the domestic politics and the international politics is all pushing in the same direction. Now, what would it mean? To my mind, instead of a new political process, it starts with the outcome. Two states, 1967 borders. Now let's implement that. Second stage, obviously, would be that on that basis, there would be a regional agreement. The Arab states would say, we end our state of belligerence or hostility with Israel. We normalize relations. We stop supporting Hamas or other anti-Israel militia groups. We stop funding them. We start arming them. We stop giving political backing to them. That can happen. Why do I say it can happen? Because the Arab and Islamic countries have said so repeatedly. And they said it recently in Riyadh when they met in an emergency meeting after October 7 and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza. So that's the second step, is the diplomatic political step. That includes Iran, by the way, because it's not only the Arab states, it's also Iran, which is, of course, a backer of Hezbollah and Hamas. But that's possible, too. But we have to also stop the hostility to Iran, which was agreed with the JCPOA agreement several years ago. And then the United States broke that. And by the way, broke it in part because of Israeli pressure. So, this was Israel pushing the U.S. to break an agreement signed with Iran. And Europe, as usual, was pitiful. It just stood by and mumbled because European leaders are afraid of the United States instead of telling the United States the truth. So this is another part of it. But anyway, second step is normalizing the diplomatic relations based on the two states. Third step is actually putting in peacekeepers. And the best that I've heard is that this peacekeeping force, which would operate under the mandate of the UN Security Council, would include Americans, would include troops that are drawn from the Arab countries. And the idea would be to create a buffer zone that would protect Israel from incursions like occurred on October 7. And on the basis of this political solution, would also demobilize the armed side of Hamas step by step, and would show basically that Hamas, which is a political, a military, and a cultural force, the military side would be ended as part of a political settlement. And this would be the next step. The step after that would be actually to promote economic recovery and development after this devastation. There's a lot to be said about this. It's tragic and a measure of human stupidity that in a world that needs so much, the first thing we do is destroy and then have to spend huge amounts simply to rebuild what we destroyed in a matter of days or weeks. But there is a reality now that Israel has destroyed the habitability of Gaza. Oh my God. Well, we're going to have to address this. And so this is another reality that needs to be added to the scene. But my basic point is move to a solution, not to an illusion, not to the status quo, not to what Israel wants right now, which is not to talk about the day after, because we know what Israel wants the day after. They murmur it every few days, which is complete control, which is absolutely unacceptable. Not to talk about, oh, we need to reestablish the Palestinian National Authority, blah, 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 because this is all fake. What we need to do is spell out where the solution is. 2 states, international law, living side by side, and with peacekeepers, and disarming the threats to both sides. And this is a very practical set of steps that could be reached. And I think it's not impossible. There are big issues, by the way, that I don't have an answer to. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who would be dead set against what I'm saying. They are settling illegally in the West Bank, many of them based on a religious fervor that they think comes from the book of Joshua from the 6th century BC. We're going to have to address this. Addressing it in human terms may mean addressing it gradually over a few years, not violently and brutally. These are human beings, in my view, completely misguided and illegal in their actions. But that needs to be addressed too. So I don't want to pretend, obviously, that I have a step-by-step solution to everything. But the point is, we've got to stop faking what's going on right now. The answer has been known for decades. But Israel has become more and more radical. And this is very sad. It's become more and more messianic in its politics. This is weird for the 21st century, but it's actually happened. So I want us to look straightforwardly, clearly at what's going on and understand this is not normal debate about security and so forth. This is about whether there's going to be peace and 2 states, or whether there's going to be an Israeli attempt to dominate millions of Palestinians or brutally suppress them or brutally ethnically cleanse them or kill a lot of them. And to my mind, the only possible alternative, and the one that the whole world agrees to, is to give political self-determination to Palestine. By the way, there was a vote on that in the General Assembly recently, quite interesting. Every country in the world that voted yes, except for 4. The 4 were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, country of 113,000 people last time I checked, and Nauru, a country of 12,000 people. So basically, the whole world has said, get on with it. Yeah, so the pressure has to come from inside the United States and from outside. From inside, public opinion absolutely does not accept the administration line on this. This is very clear in opinion survey after opinion survey. So somebody in the White House concerned about Biden's reelection must be reading this and must be understanding this is just purely bad tactics from a U.S. political point of view. That's very important. There's lots of protest in the United States. and lots of unhappiness with this. So we're not in any way locked in internally to the politics. It's bad for Biden. It's bad for U.S. interests. It's against public opinion. And so this is one point that I would make. It's not like the United States is rousing support, yes, and it's impossible to turn. It's actually deeply contested and mainly opposed. Though I acknowledge that in Washington, the pro-Israel lobby has always been very powerful. The military-industrial complex is very powerful, and the inertia is also powerful. So I'm not saying it's easy. Now, on the outside, the entire world is basically aligned on this side with one important footnote, which is that a few European countries maybe are not aligned. I don't know what the Austrian government's real position is. Sometimes it's don't side with the U.S., or maybe it really is because of more right-wing view or whatever, side with Israel, but it's very few. The problem in Europe is European politicians stop telling the truth about almost anything years ago because all they want to do is side with the United States. And I think I would just say to European politicians, if you do it, you lose at the polls. There isn't a popular government in Europe right now because it's incredible. This is so much against Europe's own political interests. So I would say, think through this honestly, and then say, it's right. We're not against Israel. We just need to move to a two-state solution. And the United States, come over here, buddy. You know it too. Let's move to a real solution. I'm waiting for European politicians to regain 2 feet on the ground, their head out of the clouds or out of U.S. control, and just state clearly, straightforwardly what is right and also what happens to be in Europe's interest. But by the way, what happens to be in Israel's interests as well, because nothing that's happening is doing anything other than gravely threatening Israel's long-term survival. This messianism, this greater Israel idea, this zealotry of this religious group, this is not saving Israel. This is threatening Israel's survival. So I want European leaders just to think clearly and honestly about this, because that'll also help the United States get to the right place.
I think there is a lot to say about the European leaders. I think the European leaders, there are no leaders, you know it better. And there is another tiny problem. We will have also an election this year in some European countries, but in the European Union for the European Parliament. And the problem is that everybody, according to most of the polls, it's to foresee that the right-wing European nationalistic right-wing parties will win. And the problem is they are even, at least concerning Israel, they are also in the meantime, also many of their parties, if to go back history, you know where they come from. And this is a historic cynicism. I think that these right-wing fascist parties, now they are on side of Israel, which is unbelievable for anybody who knows history and who knows how things happened, that these parties who are sometimes in internal issues, they are racistic, they are fascistoid right today, but when it comes to Israel, they are supporting the Jewish state.
Yeah, supporting the Jewish state is one thing. Supporting what is called Greater Israel to dominate the Palestinians is so senseless for Israel and for Europe that everybody should take a deep breath and understand that. How many self-wounds does Europe want? How many crises, how many wars does Europe want around it? And I would ask the European leaders, the reason why the right is growing is in part because the so-called center or center-left all was gung-ho with the United States for NATO enlargement and for the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's been a disaster for Europe. It's been a disaster economically for Europe. It's been a disaster from a security point of view for Europe. So it's not even left-right. It's a failure policy that the current European governments have pursued, and they are opening up their way for an opposition to arise. And that's what's happening, in fact. So the reason European politicians, by the way, across the board, you look at the approval ratings in Western Europe right now or in the EU, nobody has any support, basically, except the few that stand up for themselves, like Orban or Fico or a few others. But the ones that are basically just siding with the United States in this useless Ukraine war are all in their 20% approval ratings or 25% approval ratings and so on. So the main point I would say to Europe is, if you go the way, not of supporting Israel, that's one thing, but supporting Greater Israel for ethnic cleansing and for this terrible thing, all you're doing is making another prolonged disaster on Europe's borders. And if that's in Europe's interest, boy, please explain it to me.
This is no doubt about it. I think Europe, with this policy they follow the last tens of years, I think it's against their own security, economic, even cultural interests. I think this is something which...
I'll give you another example, by the way. The politics of the 2010s was dominated by the Syrian refugees. And anyone that knows even the slightest history should understand that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011, typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that? Explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now. And so European politicians should think about how to diffuse a Mideast-wide war.
You are completely right. I think you convince people like me. Unfortunately, we are not in power. And but coming back to the issue of this interview, I think now there is a peace plan. It's even economically, we didn't even mention it, but which is interesting for me, since you're also long experienced in economy. I think one important but not so much debated proposal is the establishment of a new UN fund. A UN Reconstruction and Sustainable Development Fund, which is interesting, should at least partially funded by reduction of expenses which traditionally have been spent for armament and war.
outside the UN across the street from headquarters is what they call Isaiah's Wall, which is the inscription of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, which says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not make war on other nations, neither will they teach war anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but, Isaiah had the idea in the 8th century BCE of the transforming the military to the civilian use. And we're now spending $2.5 trillion a year worldwide on the military. The United States is around 40% of the world's spending. Shocking, because we're 4% of the world's population. What if we take even 10% of that would be $200 billion a year. So $250 billion a year. And so that's the proposal. Create a fund funded by basically agreed cutbacks in armaments. I should mention that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio in 1967, had that idea. So I don't want to claim any precedence to this, but I do think it's the right idea. The UN in general does not command much in financial resources. It needs to have a bigger budget to do good things. And one way would be military cutbacks that are rechanneled to sustainable development.
We could continue hours and hours and hours, since many things have been already discussed for many years. But it's interesting that now this plan is here. I think, do you have any ideas how to make it even more popular? Do you intend to present it to other international bodies? And how should this come to reality?
I'm discussing these ideas with UN diplomats all the time. And I've discussed it with Palestinian diplomats and with diplomats from around the Middle East. There's a lot of resonance with this. I personally am continuing to urge an immediate membership of Palestine in the UN as a UN member state. By the way, Palestine is a state recognized by 140 other states, but it is not recognized as a UN member state, only an observer, as you rightly pointed out. So I am continuing my own discussion of this, basically with the U.S. government. They don't talk to me too much, but I try to make my views known publicly by writing and posting articles all the time. And I'm writing to politicians in the U.S. who are quite resistant in general, because their modus operandi for decades has been never show any space at all with Israel. But I'm telling them it's not working. It's not working from any point of view. You need to rethink this. So they have a few days of rethinking before the Congress comes back. The White House cannot be very comfortable. We hear lots of stories about pretty harsh talks between the U.S. and Israel right now. I believe that that's true. One of the U.S. carrier groups has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and is on its way back to the U.S. That is a signal that the U.S. does not want a wider war in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. is exhausted of war, and an election year, it would be the end of Biden's chances at all. So this is the time for pushing the politics, because it's a case where the right thing to do, the politically expedient thing to do are the same. And so I'm going to continue to push hard on that.
do you have any hope in, I think you mentioned it and everybody knows it, I think 2/3 of the international states are in favor of this kind of political and economic solution. Unfortunately, they don't have any veto at the UN. But there is something else. There is an increasing number of states working together. I think, and the South African move to the International Court is interesting because South Africa, on the other side, is one of the leading member states of this newly established group, the BRICS group. And they have even already established a kind of new banking system, financing system. Do you have any indications or ideas that from this side, more than just political statements will come to support your suggestions?
Well, the BRICS countries, all of them are on the same side that I've been advocating. China, Russia, South Africa, India has expressed also some clarity on this. Brazil, certainly. And now you have new BRIC states that have just joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's a powerful group. They're all on this side. Actually, it's interesting for me, the fact that Iran is now a BRICS member is actually going to moderate Iran, make it part of what could be a BRICS-wide consensus on a good solution. So this matters because the U.S. also looks out and says, you know, our diplomacy, we're isolated, whereas China's and Russia's diplomacy is growing in the region. This cannot make anyone happy. And we know that in the U.S. State Department, there's a lot of unhappiness about the U.S. administration policy. We don't hear all the details, but it boils over every few weeks. And so we hear about the protests coming from inside the professional diplomatic service of the United States as well. So I wouldn't give up in any way on a political change where the United States one day says, you know, we need to move forward to a real solution here. This is where I think it's very appropriate and timely to think straight. And if the European leaders are too afraid to say it in public, they should be saying it. They should be saying it in private to their American counterparts.
You have been writing about the ongoing conflict in Palestine, and I wanted to start with the U.S. role in this ongoing genocide in Gaza. The Biden administration has now bypassed the Congress twice to pass emergency armed packages, and this is despite a huge documentation about U.S. bombs being dropped in Gaza consistently, including the 2,000 pounds bunker busters that has killed several hundreds. And then there are developments on the other sides, like 60% of Americans don't support Israel in this conflict. There is a new development of U.S. organized labor that is increasingly withdrawing its support. There are constraints on the fiscal side as the U.S. military spending has exceeded $1 trillion, including all the emergency packages. And yet we see a very confident Israel about the U.S. support in this ongoing conflict. Explain to us this.
Well, I think the confidence is misplaced. It has been the fact for decades that the U.S. political system has backed Israel pretty much unconditionally. But I think that this is no longer true. And I think the Israeli leadership calculations are mistaken. The public is very unhappy and very worried about the developments in Gaza. There's very strong opposition to what Israel is doing among younger people. Biden is suffering politically in terms of the opinion polls and election prospects as a result of the disarray of U.S. foreign policy. So I think that if the Israeli government expects that this is the normal smooth ride, they will be mistaken. Now, it's true that there is a powerful pro-Israel lobby. There is a powerful support in the military-industrial complex. It has been the norm in the U.S. Congress to appropriate funds for Israel pretty much without question. Politicians like Biden, who's an old man after all, have taken it for granted that a pro-Israel stand is always the right electoral as well as the right money-raising stand. But I think that this is a wrong assessment by U.S. politicians because the public is not supportive. And it's a wrong assessment, especially by the Israeli politicians, who I think are making a very, very serious miscalculation.
Just to stay on this point, I mean, it is often said that while the American public has a huge leverage in terms of, or at least some leverage in terms of influencing its internal policies, when it comes to foreign policy, it is often said that what goes on in the public doesn't influence a lot in terms of the foreign policies. You have mentioned about the Jewish funding, but there are also talks about the American strategic.
Well, it's not just Jewish funding; it's Christian funding. It's
Yes.
there is a quite broad, and it's military-industrial complex funding. It's quite a broad coalition.
Right, absolutely. And I was just coming to the broad region in general. We are seeing a lot of tension with it around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and rockets being fired by the Houthis, and then US-led coalition has sunk boats on the other side. And we are seeing constant firing across the Lebanon border since October 8, if not earlier. And effectively, Netanyahu's cabinet, from Gallant to Gantz to his finance ministry, Smotrich, they are essentially calling for war against Iran. Now, to my mind, it's very difficult, or it's almost inconceivable to think about this very extended war by Israel alone if there is no thinking that US is not going to support or back them up. Your thoughts on that?
Well, if the U.S. doesn't back up Israel, Israel can't even keep up the war in Gaza, much less a wider Middle East war. The war in Gaza is supported by U.S. munitions almost on a daily basis. So if the U.S. cuts support, Israel has to stop, period. It's not a matter of extending to Lebanon, the Red Sea, Iran. That would be a major war. By the way, a major war not only for Israel, but a major war for the United States as well. And the U.S. has just sent one carrier group back from the region back to the United States. So it's a signal that the U.S. is not at all interested in a wider war. There are crazy U.S. politicians like Lindsey Graham who loves war anytime, anywhere. And he said we need to bomb Iran. He used even more extreme language, but basically, this is not the position of the Pentagon, and it's not the position of the American people. You raised the question of whether the public has some say in foreign policy. In general, not very much. But being an election year this year, it's strange, but foreign policy is much more on the agenda because there's a sense that Biden is incompetent, has lost control, that the U.S. is pulled into too many conflicts. And this is weighing on public opinion, especially because Donald Trump has been against funding Ukraine and the
But not Israel, right?
The Republican base is really not in favor of this spending, or particularly in terms of these wars. It's complicated, but I think in general, the mood in the United States is, my God, we've got enough problems at home. What the hell are we doing getting into more and more and more of these wars? And Biden looks very weak. and inconsequential, and he's a poor communicator in general. So this is a time when American public opinion is having an effect, especially in the Republican Party, which is not really wanting to fund Biden's adventures abroad.
I remember this foreign affairs column at the peak of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It was saying that we should bump up our support for NATO. It's not enough because the Republicans can come and they would definitely withdraw support, and we should keep this going. And we would come to Ukraine. But before that, if you could very quickly, if you could lay out this 8-point proposal that you laid out in one of your columns about how to achieve peace in the region.
Well, it's basically 1 point, which is I would like the UN Security Council today to vote the state of Palestine as a UN member state, and for that to be confirmed by the UN General Assembly, and to get on with the two-state solution. Of course, the current political constellation in Israel is dead set against this. It is absolutely intent on complete control, not only over Israel, but over Palestine. That's the real agenda. It's a self-destructive agenda as well as a deadly agenda vis-a-vis the Palestinian people. And I would like the international community to cut through this and say, look, we've had 57 years of resolutions now, or almost 57 years, UN Security Council Resolution 242. And this is that there need to be two states on the 4 June 1967 borders, and that's it. And we're moving to that solution because otherwise, well, there is no solution of peace. So this is not easy to do, but the alternatives are much worse, actually. So this is what I would recommend. Of course, then there would be peacekeepers, and that would be peacekeepers to separate the two sides, and that seems to me to be utterly feasible. There would be a normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab and Islamic neighbors, but based on Palestine being a sovereign state with control over Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Islamic holy sites. But this is what has been on the table for decades. And I would urge the international community to just move to this solution, because under the UN Charter, Security Council has the power to do this. It is in the interests of global peace to do this. There's one country that blocks it from happening, and that's the United States. And I'm hoping that when the overwhelming global opinion is on the other side, and when the alternative is so horrible as it is, and when the Israeli leaders are so vulgar and violent in their stated intentions, that this will also change the US position.
I want to move to Ukraine, but very quickly, if you can respond to just two additional questions on this. One is, as you mentioned about the Republicans either coming to power or taking charge of, or continuing charge of Congress, and that having some influence. I was wondering if there is a division between Republican policies or intent when it comes to Ukraine or Russia and when it comes to Palestine, because Donald Trump, for instance, during his presidency, while he was a dovish when it came to Russia, he was an absolute hawkish when it came to not just China, but also in Palestine. I mean, his policies were far more regressive than even some kind of moderate Obama. So that's one point. And the other point is many people now are increasingly disillusioned by the idea of the two-state settlement, two-state solution, given there are these 700,000 settlements and so on and so forth. Very quick response, because we have to discuss the rest of it.
Yeah, don't think of the Republican Party or even Donald Trump as having coherent, unified, consistent ideas, either internally consistent or consistent over time. These are political movements, and Donald Trump himself is not a stable personality. So don't look for consistency. When it comes to one state solution or two state solution, they're both possible. I think both parties would prefer a two state solution. That is also international law. The settlements are illegal. The settlers would have to go home to a very large extent. When those settlements took place, they were known to be illegal. The UN Security Council has been very clear over the years that they are illegal. This is the tragedy. Israel tried to put facts on the ground. Well, it put facts on the ground that have led to disaster. That was predictable at the time. It's happening right now. We need an answer. Okay, they could live in one state, but not an apartheid state. That's not an answer for peace. Or they could live in two states. But if they live in two states, they have to solve the problem that hundreds of thousands of settlers, many of them highly religious zealots, listening to biblical ideas from 2,600 years ago, not current realities in the world, need to adjust to current realities. So this is tough, but the current situation, the status quo, is a complete disaster. So I'm saying go with international law, go with decades of international law, go with a solution that both sides claim they prefer to somehow forcing one state together, and therefore solve the problem even of the settlements.
Let's come to Ukraine. On December 30, the New York Times reports on an Ukrainian bombardment of the Russian city of Volgorod that killed 22 people, perhaps the deadliest single attack on a Russian city since the start of the war. And this has been followed up by what the New York Times reports as heavy barrage of hypersonic Russian missiles into cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv and others.
Another party calling for, quote, greater Israel. That's their policy, is that there should never be a Palestine. There should never be Palestinian political rights. This is Israel. And a lot of the public supports that. And a lot of the public follows the line of the administration, the Israeli government, that is, that the only way to safety is to smash Palestine. And so the situation is going to continue, I think, if it's a matter of internal Israeli policy, but it's something that Israel can't do for a day without the United States. And the US has no interest, no national interest, no ethical interest, no geopolitical interest in being an accessory to mass murder.
How do you see the left, the center political parties in Israel? Because the left is so weak right now. Why the Netanyahu administration during all these years did this to the left, to the center?
There's basically no left in Israel. It's a few seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. The Israeli political scene has shifted to the far right over the years. It didn't just start on October 7. This is something that's been going on for years. Netanyahu represents and those parties represent a larger viewpoint. Israel's basically divided between those who oppose a Palestinian state because they think that God gave them all the land and they're going to assert their biblical claim, and those who follow the propaganda that say, well, even if it was right to have two states, there's no one on the other side that would accept that, and so better we have to use violence and force. That's the only realistic thing to do. But voices that say we need to solve these problems through following international law and through justice barely exists in Israel right now. I think this is a terrible, grave danger to Israel's survival because the legitimacy internationally is plummeting. And I personally don't think that the American people really have much interest in being a party to this. The American people, to the extent that they signed up with Israel, signed up to a two-state solution. They did not sign up to some biblical vision of a greater Israel that controls millions of Palestinian people. They didn't sign up for that.
Putin's recent press conference, he was talking about Odessa. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. It's a huge change in his view. The United States could have saved Odessa for Ukraine if they were going to negotiate with Russia before. How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine? Is there any will in the Biden administration to go after negotiations?
No. In 2010, 2011, 2013, Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine were that Ukraine should be neutral. That's all. And Russia negotiated with the government of Ukraine a lease to the year 2042 for Sevastopol naval base. There were no demands for annexation. There were no demands for territory. There was no claim on Crimea. There was simply a pragmatic approach. Don't join the US military alliance, and our military base, our naval base, which has been in Sevastopol, Crimea, since 1783, should remain there, and we want a long-term lease for that, which President Yanukovych negotiated. That's all the demands. Then the United States overthrew or was party to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Russia took back Crimea. Even then, there were no demands for the eastern Ukrainian regions, that is the Donbass. What Russia said was stop killing ethnic Russians, give autonomy to ethnic Russians, and that became the basis for the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement did not call for independence of the Donbass or that Russia would annex the Donbass. It just said autonomy. And it was a position backed up unanimously by the UN Security Council. But the United States said, no, we don't care. Told Ukraine, you don't have to implement that. And so that was lost. Even as late as December 2021, Putin was not making demands for territory. He was calling for the Minsk agreements to be enforced, claiming Crimea and demanding that NATO stop enlarging. Well, the United States government is deaf to the interests of any other place in the world. They're so arrogant that the position is we don't have to listen to anything. And so when President Putin put a draft security agreement on the table based on those premises that NATO would not enlarge, that the Minsk agreement would be honored finally years after it was supposed to go into effect, Biden said, nah, we don't have to negotiate. Russia launched its special military invasion in March 2022, and by then, the Duma, the Russian parliament, had recognized eastern Ukraine as independent, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent, did not annex them. That came in September 2022. But in March, it recognized their independence, but Russia demanded Ukrainian neutrality and said on that basis there could be immediate peace. And Ukraine and Russia famously were close to an agreement on ending the war weeks after it had started, weeks. And the United States said no, and Britain said no. We will not support you. You fight on. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian young men, have died since then. So this is about American foreign policy, and it's so sad. It is not just demands for territory by Russia. It is the fact that Russian demands keep rising in the context of continuing rejections from the United States. Definitely, the rhetoric has turned even more aggressive, but the White House is so stupid. Sorry, in the US, they don't understand anything. But what they certainly don't understand is that Biden should call Putin and say, we've got to stop this. We don't want to see all of Ukraine destroyed. But you're right. We should never have tried to expand NATO. That was really stupid. And you told us that since 2007. That's the call that's needed. But I don't think Biden's up to it. And certainly his neocon team opposes that very premise. Fight on, basically kidnap young people off the streets of Ukrainian cities and throw them to the front line where they're dying by the hundreds, sometimes 1,000 or more per day. That's the policy.
Well, I would put it a different way. They would like, I believe, nothing more than for the U.S. to become embroiled in a war with Iran. This is, I think, part of the goal. A wider war, we shouldn't think, is something that Israel is trying to avoid. It may well be something that Israel is trying to provoke. This is rather typical of, I don't know who the client is. I was going to say a client state manipulating a great power. I'm not sure who really the client is here, but Israel manipulates the United States, and it's happy it's got those aircraft carriers in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and now it is hoping, I think, that this could be the chance of Netanyahu's long-held desire that the United States would join a war against Iran. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation on their part. Of course, it would be, again, unimaginably horrific. It could escalate into everything because it could bring in other superpowers, and probably would bring in Russia. Who knows what would happen? And let's be clear, there are lots of fools in the US that also won't mind a wider war. We've got a warmongering group in the Senate, Lindsey Graham types and others, who always want expanded war. So we shouldn't think of this as a miscalculation. We should think of this as a provocation. If it's maybe the ethnic cleansing will work, maybe it will lead to a wider war. Either way, not so bad, says Israel. Of course, their real miscalculation is a different one, and I think it is a very serious one. They're losing the United States. Israel is losing the United States. They don't get that. Just like Biden can't imagine doing anything against Israel, the Israeli leaders think they own the Congress and the US political system, and that is coming to an end, and they do not get that. Just like our Congress doesn't understand our students, Israel certainly doesn't understand what's happening inside the United States right now. And Israel can't go on a day with this without the United States backing it in munitions and backing it diplomatically and geopolitically. So I do think Israel's making a huge miscalculation. I think they're making a cruel calculation to start with, of course, but they're making a huge miscalculation, but not exactly the one that you're pointing to. They're making a miscalculation that they have the United States in their pocket, so they can basically think of the US military as theirs to throw against whatever enemy they want. That is a falsehood. They're going to learn the hard way. I think, in fact, if this continues in this horrific way
the two-state solution really will be gone, and Israel's very survival in the long term will be deeply threatened by the approach that Israel has taken. I see no disaster greater than Netanyahu. He's really a piece of work that has done untold damage to Israel in his tenure as prime minister.
And it wouldn't be the first
Well,
time.
he sees
that
the
the
end
West
possibly
abandons
coming.
them.
For
I was just gonna
himself.
say, Jim, go ahead, please.
Well, he sees the end possibly coming, but it's his life's work preventing a Palestinian state. And one of the
Exactly.
things you brought up, and you may be right about all of this is planned. I don't like to engage in conspiracy theories, but was it all planned in order to lead to another Nakba where Palestinians could be expelled out of Israel? And certainly some cabinet ministers have basically proposed that, saying that Western countries should accept Palestinians in to give them shelter so that they have a future in another place, because they don't want them to have a future. But you tried to talk a little bit before the United Nations about what we need to do to rebuild. The day, even if, let's just suppose that there is a ceasefire coming, and what do we do on day 2? Gaza is all but gone. You talked about getting 10% of the defense budgets of leading countries around the globe to invest in a sustainable reconstruction of Gaza and the Palestinian occupied territories. But, how do you get people to go along with that? Because remember, I mean, when they're doing deficit spending, somebody's benefiting, meaning Raytheon, at Omnia, they're benefiting from all of these wars. And if you stop that, if you take away 10% of that, that is a lot of money.
People are going to suffer for years and decades out of what is happening in these days, without question. The loss of life, but the destruction of hundreds of thousands of homes, the dislocation of 2 million people so far. This is devastating, and the destruction in Gaza will have a price tag that under any circumstances the world will not cover. So people will suffer and will be dislocated and impoverished and without any ultimate solution or compensation to this. But what will happen, and it will drive me crazy, by the way, thank God the day the fighting stops, then we'll have a donors conference. And the governments will get together and say, oh, we're going to commit tens of billions of dollars to rebuild what was just destroyed. And it's so stupid that we behave this way, because a lot of my life and career is about trying to raise any funds for impoverished people, getting kids in school, building health clinics. And the idea that you bomb places and then throw the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars at what you just willfully destroyed, but you would never come up with such funding for just helping poor people in the first place is the reality. And remember, it's as we muse about who's going to rebuild Gaza, and the answer is nobody is going to rebuild much of it. The Ukrainians, they actually hold meetings thinking, oh, we're going to have a $750 billion fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Yeah, good luck with that one too. So this is tragedy compounding tragedy. Of course, we have a doctrine in general in economics, an incentive doctrine, which is the polluter pay principle, which is you make the damage, you pay. That's how our courts work also. If it's a trespass or a noxious tort, a public nuisance is the legal term. Israel should pay for this. It destroyed Gaza. It should pay for this. Well, let's try that one. That one's not going to go too well either. But that is that's the principle that should apply, so that a government thinks twice before it destroys another place.
So it's interesting because it moves us. There's a couple of areas I'd like us to cover as we're kind of nearing the end of this great, interview, Jeff. One area is the economics of war and peace, and I'd love to for you to comment on the juxtaposition that we're seeing now. On the one hand, you've got the utter destruction of Gaza, which is a fairly small place. I mean, Gaza is not this massive World War II kind of Marshall Plan for Western Europe. It's just basically the size, less than the size of Manhattan. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. However, on the other end, you've got a damaged Israeli economy that's basically shedding hundreds of millions of dollars on a daily basis. by an estimate, it's about $12 billion worth of economic, well, that's not opportunity cost, that's direct cost to the war so far in the 60 days. Add to that the opportunity cost for the 300,000 reservists. So
and the destruction of the shipping now, which is blocked in the Red Sea, and ships turning away, all of that.
And you're seeing a reduction. Even Israelis are starting to leave, which is fascinating. I was reading somewhere that between 300 and 400,000 Israeli, presumably productive ones that don't want to waste their time on nonsensical wars, they're going to go to the West and be productive and safe with their families and stuff. So you've got that also going up. And in parallel, and I know you were just in Doha not long ago in the Gulf, and you're seeing this unbelievable wealth creation that is happening in Saudi, where essentially there's been a doubling of productivity just by allowing women to enter into the workforce. And you've got, all that going on in the Gulf, just a complete buildup of that. And if we look at some of the demographics, we're looking at maybe 20 years ago, the Arab world was about 220 million. Now we're about 470 million. And by some projections, the MENA region is going to be 770 million by 2050. And you're seeing this juxtaposition, of these stories. How do you see that playing out, And can really Israel sustainably, from an economic perspective, still sell itself as being this strategic beachhead for the United States at a time when the United States, if it so wanted, has an entire region that's larger than the actual landmass of the United States itself, with potential 770 million people that it can alienate or pacify? I mean, how do you see that in your mind playing out?
Well, I think there are a number of issues here. First, this is very, very costly for Israel, and that's good because maybe it means that Israel will stop what it's doing. Israel cannot afford, ultimately, the greater Israel approach, which is the approach of ethnic cleansing or continued apartheid over the West Bank and Gaza. It doesn't know that yet. It can't sustain US backing for that. It can't sustain the isolation that will come from that. It can't sustain the ongoing fighting that will come from that. So that's one part. More generally, war is a good business for 5 companies in the military industrial complex in the United States, but for the world, it's a totally rotten business, of course. Not only does it create tragedy, but it creates mass destruction that is extremely costly to pick up, and the direct outlays on armaments worldwide now is probably $2.5 to $3 trillion. The estimate is about $2.5 trillion, of which the United States is typically measured at $1 trillion, but it's actually much larger than that when you count all of the budget item lines, maybe up to $1.5 trillion a year. So this is all costly, all wasteful. I every day invoke Isaiah, the 8th century prophet whose words are on the wall just across the street of the UN on First Avenue, chapter 2, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations won't make war on nations, neither will they learn war anymore. He's speaking economically. We should be transforming our armaments into productive activities. This is unbelievable waste, stupidity, and danger, what we're doing. Again, these wars could end essentially immediately, because I also like to quote Karl von Clausewitz, the war theorist in Germany after the Napoleonic Wars, who said that war is the continuation of politics with other means. And his point was that war is a kind of politics. So I say, look to the underlying politics. The underlying politics of the war in Gaza is, will there be a Palestinian state or will there be greater Israel? Well, the only answer that can possibly lead to peace is a Palestinian state. And we should cut to the chase and go straight there. As I mentioned, when we look at the war in Ukraine, the underlying politics is the United States trying to push its military to the border of Russia, to surround Russia in the Black Sea, an idea that Zbigniew Brzezinski described in detail in 1997, and that the US has been trying to carry out. It's led to disaster. Again, it's politics. So if we want to stop the war, it's not military that will do it, it's politics that will end these wars, and they could end immediately. We'd save a fortune. The people in the world would be hugely benefited. Of course, those under the bombs first and foremost, but all of us would benefit. Maybe Lockheed or Raytheon shares would go down a little bit. That would be just fine.
Can I ask a question about Lebanon?
Go ahead, Tariq. And there is one question I wanted to get a comment from Jeffrey on.
About Lebanon and the situation in Lebanon and the resolution, UN resolution 1701. Now it's back on the table, and Amos 16 is being back and forth trying to implement borderline and the resolution 1701. Any information on that and the IMF plan for recovery of Lebanon? What do you have for Lebanon? What do you like to say for the Lebanese audience about these two topics?
I
need another hour.
I wish I could help you on that more specifically, but precisely while that debate has been going on, I was at COP28 and then in Ethiopia, just got back yesterday. So my consultations with diplomats on that start this week.
Would you comment on COP28? What's your take on it? And do you think, as is being reported, it's at least an acceptable move forward? Did it disappoint you in terms of its reach, or were you actually surprised, given that it was held in in an OPEC, at the end of the day, in an OPEC nation, and something did come out of it at the end?
I was glad that it was held in the Gulf region, and I think the president of COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber, did a very good job, and the outcome is, as these things go, good. Now, I say as these things go because there's paper and then there's reality. And the paper document that came out is a step forward, definitely. The reality is that the big powers are all directed at these war and peace issues, not at this climate issue. And until we end these wars, we're not going to get the kind of real political capital to decarbonize the world economy, to face up to the financing challenges, and so forth. So I go to COP meetings, all these Conference of the Parties each year, and they're big, interesting jamborees. There were nearly 100,000 people there. A true measure of massive world interest, massive business interest, massive civil society interest, massive scientific interest. But in terms of superpower politics, that's not where the real answers are. And right now, the superpowers are in conflict and in war, and we've got to end that so that they focus on something absolutely real, which is making the planet viable from a climate point of view for the 21st century.
Well, Jeff, I think, I don't know if any of my colleagues has any more questions, but I do have one last question for you. And it's something that I heard you say, which was, you know, obviously I've known you for a long time, but it's still impressive. It's you stated, and I quote, "Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not to believe that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule in every place." And I thought that was a really interesting quote, because you kind of, in many ways, highlight the aspirations of a lot of people who are more on the peace side of things, realizing the sacrifices that might need to be taken. But I'd love for you to comment on this, and whether you look at, you know, the next few weeks, months, years in an optimistic tone, or whether, you know, having been in development and having been, you know, in the throes of geopolitics and the UN for such a long time, whether you've reached a point where you're looking at it more from a pessimistic perspective, or an optimistic one.
Let me mention two things. First, immediately in the Israel-Gaza war, those Israelis, and that includes this current government and the cabinet, that believe that Israel has the right, and they would say a God-given right, to rule over the Palestinian people or over the Palestinian territories, is the essence of this conflict. And it's unacceptable. And the people of Israel need to live side by side with the Palestinians in peace, and it's perfectly possible to do. But they have to give up their aspiration to rule all of the land. And some Israelis believe that's what the book of Joshua gave them, or some biblical interpretation, and it is has to be put aside. Nobody has that right, not from God, not from a book of the Bible. People have to live decently, and they have to respect each other. And that's the only way we can survive on this planet. When it comes to the United States, it's even more grandiose. The United States ideology is, and Biden repeated it recently, the US is the indispensable country. It's the country the world looks to for leadership. This is false. It was always false. But in the heyday of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, maybe there was maybe that delusion could be at least a little understood. Is the US really the country the whole world's looking to right now, when it stands alone against the rest of the world? Of course not. The US needs to learn to cooperate. It needs to learn to put aside its own delusion of hegemony. And there are leaders, in fact, it includes this very government, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, who really believe in US hegemony. Well, it's a nonsense. It's a fiction. It's worse than an anachronism, because an anachronism would imply that it was maybe once true. It was never true. And so this is the similar kind of terrible falsehood that needs to be put aside if we're going to get to peace.
Doctor, last word. Is the UN time for reshuffling, time to restructuring, time for new laws, for the UN to be more effective, to be able to defend these people? It's time for change in the UN?
Well, I love the UN, first of all, as frustrating as it is, because it is the place where the world meets, and it's the only place where the world meets. And when the world meets, it speaks with a huge voice, peace and justice for Palestine. So it's pretty impressive. Now, it has a voice, but it doesn't have an army. It doesn't have its own tax authority. It is a club of 193 nations. It was founded by nations. It was founded by nations. This is important. It's not global government. It's United Nations. And this is a bit of a problem. I'm in favor of more power, for example, some direct tax power, so that at the global level, we can get some funding for poor people or for emergencies or for other things that we need. Now, next September, there will be a summit of the future at the UN. This is a once in a generation. In fact, it's the first time ever that such a summit has taken place. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the world, think about what we want and what we need for the balance of the 21st century. And we will meet the 22nd and 23rd of September. By then, hopefully, there will actually be some creative agreements reached about the kind of restructuring or strengthening of a new multipolar world and a stronger set of UN institutions that can work for the 21st century. So I'm a believer. I know in history, we've never had global governance. This is only the second attempt in all of world history to have this. The first was the League of Nations. It failed within a generation. The United Nations is 78 years old this year. It is, as I say, I love it, and it's incredibly frustrating that we can't solve more problems in the way we need to. But we should understand this is a new attempt in human history to have global scale governance. So I don't want us to give up on it. I don't want us to be cynical about it. I want us to fix things so that we can actually make it work. The answer is quite simple. The United States does not want to stop the wars. In fact, the United States is the enabler of so many wars around the world. It's really tragic. When it comes to the war in Gaza right now, if the United States stopped providing munitions to Israel, the war would end in a day. This war literally continues only because Israel gets munitions from the United States. It's not even out of stockpiles, it's out of new deliveries all the time. So if the United States took the choice per force, the fighting would stop. Of course, if the United States took political decisions, not vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, abiding by UN Security Council resolutions calling for a two-state solution, I think that on political grounds, the war in Gaza could end essentially immediately. I talked about other wars, just to mention them quickly. The war in Syria, which has gone on since 2011, is a US regime change operation gone wrong, as most of them do, in a very deep way. It was decided by the US and some of the regional partners that they would bring down Bashar al-Assad. And President Obama gave a famous finding, the Timber Sycamore operation of the CIA to bring down Assad. It failed, but it has caused 12 years of nonstop war. And I know through my work in the UN that war could have ended in 2012, but the US blocked the solution to the war. There was an agreement to end the war, but the United States said, no, Assad must go or the war continues. Similarly, I talked about the Ukraine war. This is a completely misunderstood war because of the US narrative, which is false. This is a war caused by the US overthrow of the Ukrainian government in February 2014, followed by, and for the purpose of, and followed by an attempt until today to extend NATO to the border of Russia. And Russia, understandably, in my view, completely understandably, would not have it. And so this is a war over NATO enlargement. If the United States said any moment, NATO will not expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, by the way, which was put as a pair with Ukraine, the war would end. In fact, it almost did end in April 2022, weeks after the start of Russia's special military operation, because that whole invasion in February 2022 was designed not to take over the country, but to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, which it did. Zelensky and the Ukrainian government negotiated a peace with Russia based on neutrality, and the United States stepped in and said, no way, you're signing that. And the war has continued since then. So these are wars of choice. They are wars, in my view, of an American empire, a very misguided one. I'm an American. This is a government that is not serving my purposes at all. It's wasting my money and it's killing a lot of people. So I find it all disgusting. I can tell you, and I don't mean to sound absurdly personal about it, but no government's ever asked me about this in the sense that these issues are not publicly debated in the United States. The causes of the wars are hidden from view. The narratives officially are lies. The votes on funding the wars are pushed through Congress almost without public debate. And so public opinion plays almost no role. So this is another sad part of this. But the long answer to your short question is these are wars of choice that the United States could stop immediately, but for various political and geopolitical reasons, chooses not to stop at the great cost for humanity and at the great cost for risks of further escalation.
So I'd like to pick up on the cost side of things. Clearly, you know, the United States has had to pay a hefty price tag in most of its wars, to the tune of trillions, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, etc. And you know, at home, there's a lot of political pressures that are being exerted. Now, specifically as it pertains to the Israeli-Gaza war, these pressures have really flooded into the streets, maybe not to that degree with respect to the Ukraine or some of the other wars, but with the Israeli-Gaza war, I mean, we've seen, you know, manifestations in LA, in New York, you know, even from all sorts of communities, Palestinian, even Jewish communities, all kinds of communities. And some of them are basically starting to question verbally, like never before, these kinds of policies that the U.S. administration, you know, is undertaking. I think even the State Department has had some may I call it clandestine, because they had their faces covered in front of the White House manifestations so that they're not under any risk, but kind of to also object to the current policies of the United States. Would you be able to kind of shed a little bit to, you know, your opinion on how much that's playing a part in what appears to be a shift in U.S. policy from October 7th to today? And is that trend going to continue going forward in your opinion? Or is there something that's going to hamper it and not allow it to go any further?
So I think there are two parts to the question, if I might. First is a bit about the costs financially, and then the costs politically. The costs financially of the U.S. wars of choice in the 21st century really dated to 9/11, if we might, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and many other smaller wars as well. Come to, according to different estimates, somewhere between $5 and $8 trillion. Even for a macroeconomist like myself, that's not small change. This is 25% or 33% from a quarter to a third of the US annual output. Now, the reason that these wars have been able to be prosecuted at such cost and with no positive results for America or for the world is that they've been run on credit. If an American president said, we want to fight the war, we're going to raise your taxes to do it, the wars would end in one moment. So these are wars that are fought on deficit finance. The debt has been rising. The US debt, public debt, that is, the debt owed by the Treasury, measured as a share of our US national income, has increased from about 35% of our national income to about 100% of our national income between the year 2000 and today. This is a huge increase of debt, but it is not noticed up front because it is adding to the tab that's coming due. It's not an immediate burden. And similarly, of course, if there was even a breath of anything like a draft of actually Americans serving in any of these wars by a draft, they would also end in a moment because the public doesn't support any of this. But these are wars that presidents are able to carry out essentially on their own personal authority, with a bit financed by Congress. Why? Because it's not noticed by the American people, and it's very popular with the military-industrial complex. After all, these wars are big business. This is no question part of the story. You have Boeing, you have Lockheed Martin, you have Northrop Grumman, you have General Dynamics, you have Raytheon, 5 big companies that have hundreds of billions of dollars of arms contracts. And they spread that back to Congress, especially to the Armed Services Committee. So we have a can I say a shitstorm in our politics because it's so corrupt now. And even, I shouldn't say even, Biden, who is not a very impressive politician to say the least, in trying to make the case for aid, actually doesn't make the case in terms of ethics, morality, safety, security, but he shows where the weapons are being produced and where the jobs are in the different congressional districts. So it's pretty crude stuff. Now, again, the American people would not tolerate any direct burden of this. So all of this is done on the side. Most people don't follow and don't really feel the budget deficits, except recently in the last couple of years, interest rates have gone up a lot. US credit ratings have come down. House prices, mortgage costs are going up. So people are starting to also even make that financial link, even though all of this is debt financed. They're saying, you know, I'm feeling the pain from this. And of course, if they factor in the trillions of debt that is going to have to be paid in the future by taxes or by inflation, they would feel it even more. But this is starting to be felt, and it's one of the reasons why Congress pushed back in recent months, not just what they would normally do of signing the bill, but a lot of congressmen saying the price is too high, even in a financial sense. Now, when you come to the political